So the declaration is what I'm calling, and I've been calling it this for a little while, but it's what's missing. It's what's most often forgotten, and I've actually been talking about it from the very beginning. If you go back to 2017 videos, you will find me talking about this. And if you ask me what is an essential element of my practice, eventually I have to talk about this. But for some reason, in one-on-ones and when we're in class and when we're talking about our practice, I never hear it. I'm like, well, this is weird. And so I think it's just so important that we just talk about that before we talk about building our toolbox. And the reason I have separated that as a topic is because I want to give you a bunch of examples. And of course, my toolboxes are divided into 4 directions. But declaration would be, I will say that to myself. And so you might be saying this is very similar to what we would say in productive self-dialogue. And that's exactly what this is. This is a form of productive self-dialogue, and it's especially important 2 different times: when you're interacting with your toolbox and when you're redirecting. And it's forgotten specifically with those 2 times. When you're establishing your toolbox, your point of attention, establishing your point of attention in your toolbox using a declaration, that's how you know that was intended in advance, because either you're saying it in your mind. Eventually a person, when they're really in have some momentum with their practice, this is a very process. It's but I still declare stuff, like I was just about to declare it to you, right? Because an emotion might start to come up that, like, oh crap, I only have 8 weeks. Wait a second. I'm going to do my practice. That's all I'm going to focus on right now. I got to go back to my practice because I'm starting to feel an emotional disruption. There's a disruption in the force. I can feel it. And so I'm just going to go back to my practice. I'm not going to evaluate it. I'm not going to try to understand it. I'm not going to try to push it away. I'm not going to try to deny it. I'm not going to pour me. I'm not going to take it personal. I'm going to go back to the 4 directions of attention, and I'm going to intend my points in advance, and I'm going to make a declaration in that process, because this is starting to sound like redirection almost, right? Like I was redirecting because of the self-awareness degree in that moment. I can feel when there's a disturbance in my force. That's subtle, right? So I'm feeling myself going away from that subtlety, and I know that that's alarms are going off for me. I'm like, no, don't want to do that. I want to go back to the subtle. I want to go back to presence. I want to go back to awareness. I want to go back to quality. I want to go back to aliveness. So ultimately, this is something I tell myself. And I say it very quickly, and it can be very abbreviated sometimes, but the bottom line is that I am, and I don't always say this portion, but I'll say it for you. All of my behavior is driven by state of being and being aware of how things make me feel. So am I going to lie again in my life? I think maybe if I think I have to, like maybe if somebody's going to get really embarrassed and a little white lie can help prevent that, I probably will, it, whatever. But I don't like the feeling of being dishonest with people. And that feeling is something that I'm so aware of because of my practice. So if I were just to tell somebody just a straight up outright lie, like I used to do when I was in high school, or even after high school, I would just say something because I thought it would make me look cooler or something. I don't know. But I can't. The feeling of it to me now is just unacceptable. Why did you do that? Like, what kind of attachment to yourself do you have right now? Like, why do you have to project that? These are the things that would be going through my mind, right? This is my mind. This is what I would be saying to myself. This is how I prevent self-hustle, because I would start to ask myself questions that I know that logically I can't answer logically, right? So this is all a part of this declaration, and it's leading up to, no, no, I'm just going to go back to my practice. There's my breath. Here's my bubble of perception, right? And then here is this feeling of quality and patience, being patient with myself in this example, maybe because a little bit of redirection was necessary. So intention, you are declaring your intention. You are declaring it to spirit, you're declaring it to yourself, and eventually I would concede that declaration doesn't need to be in words. But for the sake of, until you are maintaining 4 directions of attention uh, for the majority of your day, I don't know that that is tenable, because one of the things that this practice does is it interrupts and then elongates the interruption to the point that a person can maintain an absence of internal self-talk. However you want to look at it, that's not occurring. The self-talk isn't occurring. We don't have to look at it as negative and that we're subtract, because obviously we're not subtracting anything. We're engaging our 4 directions to such an acute and specific focus that it creates context disarrangement. And our chains are broken in that moment. Well, one of my favorite feelings, and it's not all the time. This isn't quite one that I can. It's not so easy for me just to deliberately modulate to this and hold it, but that feeling of freedom. Like, people talk about freedom in a really weird way, because if somebody can give it to you or take it away, we're actually probably talking about something that needs a different word or a different definition, or at least some clarification on what I'm talking about when I use that word. Because when I use that word, nobody can take that away from me. I think I'm getting closer to like the Nelson Mandela, or some of the people who have experienced injustices, where their mind is the source of freedom. And not only that, it's the feeling that the mind is helping to generate the feeling of my chains are broken. My bonds that are holding me down have at least temporarily loosened, if not let go. That's a feeling of freedom. And I can't tell you what that feels like, honestly. You know, if I were to discuss this with somebody, we would just maybe have to talk about the circumstances that occurred right before it, what it led to afterwards, and then maybe also a little bit of how it made us feel, like I just did, the feeling untethered all of a sudden. It's a feeling, nothing else. So it's very difficult to describe. But the declaration, in the best way to associate it to what we've talked about so far, is to declare your intentional point in advance, to declare that this is my point of attention. In the beginning, that is very valuable to just say it. So today, or, on my way to work, I'm going to make sure that while I'm driving, I'm paying attention to the sky and the earth, because I can do that. I actually can. When I'm driving, I can see, I can be aware of the sky. It's right there, even in Chicago, and there's buildings. So there's no excuse really, unless you live in a bubble dome that's reflective or something. So the sky is always there, but why don't I pay attention to it? Well, that's something that we'll get more into when we talk about theory. Because, spoiler alert, I use the word theory in a scientific sense. So I'll talk about what we know about the mind and how it relates to this practice. So the declaration then is, especially in the beginning, it's setting up your practice. It's declaring it to yourself, maybe even declaring it to another person. If you have an accountability buddy, which is probably going to be rare, because I don't know how often you've ever been in a room with 2 people who practice this. So that's an interesting point to underline, I guess. But yeah, so declaration, I am going to declare where my point of attention is. What am I doing? So if I'm doing a particular body awareness technique, like what am I paying attention to today and why? Well, maybe not why. You don't have to do why. I do why sometimes because what I'm doing has medical implications. I'm paying attention to acupuncture points because I have had a lot of acupuncturists tell me that they do believe it's possible to activate certain points and channels with your mind, but that you can't possibly ask a patient to do that because they're not going to have the focus and concentration necessary. And I, for the most part, would agree with that. I can't disagree. but that doesn't mean I can't do it myself. So it's very intentional. It's very deliberate. And I do declare it. I do declare it. And then, of course, it's a part of redirection when we talk about that, because oftentimes we don't talk out our practice. And that's also the declaration. So when you talk out your practice, you're setting it up, whether you're saying it in your mind. And I do this, and I've done this up until this point. Like, it's not something new. Is I'll set it up in my mind. All right, where's my first direction? Where's my external point? Where's my internal point? What am I doing with my breath? I'm setting up my practice. And it's the same thing when I redirect. I set it up. I declare it out loud. This is my mind. That's a declaration. This is my body. Nobody is doing anything to me outside of physical touch. How am I using the declaration in the form of a quote that means something to me? And that is productive self-dialogue. It's a form, I would call it productive self-dialogue more in a theory type of setting rather than the core foundational type of setting. But if you remove the declaration, this practice gets wishy-washy, I think. I think it's just a bunch of hit and miss. Sometimes it's like, okay, I'm on it, I got it. And then sometimes it's like, nope. Looking back, those last 6 hours, or the 3 hours that I was watching, that Martin Scorsese movie. He has long movies, right? Martin Scorsese. I keep using him as an example. I don't even know if it's true. Leonardo DiCaprio movies are like 3 hours, 3.5 hours. And then you're done with the movie and you're like, oh, well, I didn't have any point of attention. Is that a problem? It's not a problem, but you're going to notice those gaps more and more. And then you're going to notice, like, when you do have a point of attention, it actually, just like everything else, it adds a very interesting element to what you're doing, because it's 2 degrees, remember? I really like to, when I watch movies, I like to look at the whole screen. I really try to expand my vision so that I'm not just focusing on what the director wants me to. We've talked about this. Whenever I would watch the news, whenever I'd watch TV, what's the books on their bookshelf? I just really like to look behind them. Why? Because my mind isn't used to doing it, and it's a form of context disarrangement, and it helps to disrupt and interrupt normal patterns that don't serve me. It's all about interrupting interference, establishing, maintaining, or elongating, and then maintaining these disruptions. And really what we learn is that we can create context disarrangement with our own direction of attention alone. And that is what we might call point of view. We just change how we view things. We change how we look at things. The thing itself doesn't necessarily change, although it does, but